Welcome to Bury Our Bones with Cinema, the podcast that lives, breathes and dies both classic movies and the straight-to-DVD releases that we are just not allowed to talk about. In today's episode, we fast travel to the open world that is video game adaptations that got it wrong. So don't forget to load up on some useless inventory items, complete any side quests so that we're way above level for any story-based missions, and finally, take an inevitable detour into an oversized boss battle with a glowing red weak spot. It's time to bury our bones with cinema.
Tyler Durden's Underground Arts and Crafts Club. Meet up with like-minded people just like you. Learn craft skills like soap making, electronics and leafleting. The Tyler Durden Underground Arts and Crafts Club, coming to a car park near you. Terms and conditions will apply.
So, welcome back to another episode of Bury Our Bones with Cinema. As the intro alluded to, we are going to be looking at some video game movies that kind of got it wrong. Now, video game movies have kind of been a bit of a, well, I was going to say a mixed bag, but they haven't really been a mixed bag. In actual fact, they've been a very poor bag in the sense of that there hasn't really been too many, video game adaptations that have actually been really, really good films. There are, a couple, but there's not, a great deal to choose from. So trying to pick, some bad films, actually there was quite a lot of choice when it comes to video game adaptations. I think part of the reason for that is because obviously when you switch from, video games to movies, obviously the mediums are very, very different, and naturally the way in which they're going to tell their stories and the narratives that they're going to navigate through are going to be very, very different. So in actual fact, when we some games, for example, have very thought out, great characters that we can bond with, that we enjoy playing as. Games like The Last of Us, for example, games like Uncharted. But some games give you that freedom to create your own character, so therefore you can kind of fill in the blanks and you can become whatever you want in that particular world. Obviously, those are, two different types of games. But on the whole, video game adaptations have not been particularly successful, at least from a critical standpoint. From a box office standpoint, probably a little bit more profitable than they otherwise would be if they didn't already have intellectual properties in the video game sector. So we're going to look at some bad video game adaptations, essentially, the ones that got it wrong, the ones that kind of missed the point, and to kick us off, we're going to have a look at some honourable mentions. So the first thing I'm going to preface this with is that nothing by Ubol is going to be on this list. So films like Alone in the Dark, Far Cry, Blood Rain, specifically wanted to focus on films that actually had a chance to be good from the outset, rather than films that were, in all honesty, never ever going to be that good. So we're not really looking at films that release straight to DVD. On the whole, we're going to be looking at films that did have a box office taking and did release wide, in a wide way. And Ubol, apparently he likes video games, hence why he makes all these video game movies. But I think I'm fair in saying that his filmmaking skill isn't particularly on the same par as, say, Steven Spielberg or a Martin Scorsese or anybody like that. So we're not going to be looking at any of those kind of films because, to be honest, that would be a very, very negative episode. And whilst it is fun to look at the negatives sometimes, we do want to have a little bit of lightheartedness in there as well, which it may be very difficult when films are just that bad. But another honourable mention, I mentioned the game series earlier, Uncharted. So not so long ago, the Uncharted film came out. Now, this one had a little bit of a difficult production, or at least before it started filming. It was, pretty much as soon as the game came out, they started talking about making a movie of it, and for good reason, because it's a very, very good game that can or should be able to fairly easily translate to film, due to the fact that it is very, very similar to Indiana Jones, in that kind of, we have a strong male protagonist who goes on the hunt for hidden artifacts and explores all of these hidden ancient worlds. It's very, very similar in that I think Uncharted takes a lot of its inspiration from those Indiana Jones films. Now, I think the problem they had with the film of Uncharted, I think obviously when they first were talking about making the film, Mark Wahlberg was obviously a massive contender to play Nathan Drake and was cast as Nathan Drake. As far as I'm aware, the problem being is that because of how long it got taken to let's start that sentence again. How long it took to get made, Mark Wahlberg had actually aged himself out of the role of Nathan Drake. But because he'd already signed on to it, he's already committed to it, rather than let him go, they decided to unintelligently cast him in the role of Sully. Now, personally, in my eyes, that was the biggest problem with the film. I can kind of get on board a little bit with Tom Holland as Nathan Drake. I think he was a bit young, but I could get on board with it. I'd seen him in Spider-Man, so it kind of worked in that same kind of wisecracking, slightly goofy character. I kind of get on board with that. But the problem is that Sully is very much that old school, character that unfortunately Mark Wahlberg isn't that. He's not old enough and not experienced enough, or at least not in his approach. He may be the same sort of age as perhaps Sully was. Sorry, not Scully. It's not the X-Files. Maybe the same age as Sully, but he doesn't feel like a Sully. I'm thinking of like people like John Goodman, people like James Gandolfini, who their time was yesteryear, and now they're just there in the supporting roles. That's kind of what I pictured, or at least more in that avenue rather than Mark Wahlberg. So it just straight from the off, that dynamic that Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland had was very different to what we had in the films because of that. It didn't quite work, in my opinion, because we believed that Mark Wahlberg could still do all of the things that he was saying he couldn't do, that he was like, oh, I'm too old for this, There's another name that could have played that Sully character, Danny Glover, back in the 80s had that kind of feel to it, so a lot of that Uncharted series is built on that chemistry and that character relationship, because for the most part you're playing as Nathan Drake, and you've got those small conversations in between those action sequences and in between those platform sequences. Another honourable mention is, unfortunately, another Mark Wahlberg film. So he doesn't seem to have a great track record when it comes to making video game film adaptations, but Max Payne. I think, especially the first Max Payne game was, a very has a cult following. It had a very film noir-esque kind of feel to it, which I believe they tried to do in the Max Payne film. But again, for me, it felt very much like it was just a Mark Wahlberg career vehicle, rather than let's actually make the best game that we can, make the best film that we can make based off of this game. So again, it didn't quite work for me. So those are some honourable mentions there. But to kick us off, to get us started, we're going to have to go back to 1994, December 23rd, 1994, to the much maligned, often hated Street Fighter. So I'm just going to let that pause sit there, because I think a lot of people who have seen this film will know exactly why it's on this list. It's something that Street Fighter fans don't really want to talk about. It's not ever going to be on, the vast majority of people's watch lists, other than to have a bit of a laugh, and not because the script is funny, or the script intends to be funny. It's going to be because the script is a little bit poor, isn't funny, misses the point, and gets a hell of a lot wrong. It's really, really is one of the worst video game adaptation films, other than the U-Bowl collection, unfortunately. I think when you think about bad video game adaptations, this is the one that a lot of people come to when they first start talking about these things. So one thing we always forget to do on Bury Our Bones with Cinema, and I'm not quite sure why, but we always forget to go through the plot. Now, part of that probably is because we assume that if you're listening to an episode on a film or on a couple of films, then we'd like to think you'd already seen the film, because there's a lot of spoilers involved. So it'd be a bit of a silly thing to do if you want to go and watch a film and you listen to our episode first. But if that's what you want to do, that's what you want to do. But be warned, there are going to be some spoilers. But let's get the plot out of the way. So, after months of fighting, a multinational military force of the Allied nations has managed to enter the city. The AN is fighting against the armed forces of drug lord turned evil warlord General M. Bison, who has recently captured a couple of dozen AN workers. Bison makes his demands in a live two-way TV broadcast with William F. Guile, the commander of the AN forces. If he's not paid $20 billion in 3 days, he will kill the hostages. And so Guile and M. Bison will be facing off in the ultimate final showdown, which, to be fair, sounds like another fighting game in itself. Final showdown. So that's the plot. And it's a very generic plot, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I don't think that's the reason why this film doesn't work. I think sometimes when you do have a video game property working off, I think there is some expectations involved with what necessarily needs to happen in the narrative. But I don't think that general, narrative structure and framework is a particularly bad thing. I think the way it's executed is where it starts to fall down. So I think one of the things to probably consider when it comes to video game films is part of whether or not you like the film, or whether or not you love the film or hate it, or whatever it may be. Part of your opinion is formed based off of whether or not you're a fan of the game. Now, if you're a fan of Street Fighter in 1994, chances are you'd have flocked to the movie theatre to go and see it because you like the game. Therefore, it's not too much of a stretch or of the imagination to think that you're going to like the film. If you dislike it, however, if you're not a fan of Street Fighter, they're working uphill. They've got to do an awful lot to get you into the movie theatre, to make you pay some money to go and see it. So immediately you're almost cutting the audience in half, or at least, splitting it up into different sections and going, well, what, we've got our diehard fans who will see a Street Fighter film no matter what, but what can we do to get these other people? And I think that is a balancing act that very few, as I've alluded to, very few video game films have managed to do. Having said that, that's not to say that they're not successful at the box office. because of those pre-love dispersions of intellectual properties and of video games, you're almost guaranteed to make money. Almost guaranteed, not always, but almost. So in December 1994, this released 2 days before Christmas in the United States, on December 23rd, 1994, and it was made with a budget of around $35 million, which is quite a sizable chunk of change in 1994. So it kind of tells you the kind of things that they had hoped for this film. And I suppose in their opening weekend, they made a little bit of what we call in the UK squeaky bum time. Football fans will know what that means. But for anybody who doesn't know what squeaky bum time means, it just means a little bit nervous. They were on edge. They were, biting their fingernails when the opening weekend stats came through, because they only made just under $7 million in its opening weekend, which, when you spent $35 million, you want to see a sizable return in that opening weekend. So if we translate that to, its gross across the US and Canada, it didn't make any money in US and Canada. It only made $33.4 million. So they're really hoping that the rest of the world flock to see this film, because if they don't, then if they're making a profit, it's not going to be a massive profit. It's going to be, probably just about break even. But luckily, the rest of the world also flocked to see this film, as it made another $99.4 million. So they made their money back, doubled it, and then some. So from that perspective, I would like to think they were happy. However, they probably had higher hopes. They probably were thinking they wanted to get into those, latter stages of the 100, early 200 millions, is what I can imagine they were expecting with a $35 million budget. So moving on to the crew. So this was directed and written by Stephen E. D'Souza. It was helped with producing by Edward R. Pressman and Kenzo Shishimoto. The composer was Graham Revell. The cinematographer was William A. Fraker. It was edited by Edward M. Abrams, Don Aaron, Dov Herning, Anthony Redmond, Robert F. Shrewgrew. And the casting directors were Steve Brooksbank, Kate Dunn Kennedy, and Mary Jo Slater. And the production designer was William J. Kreber. So, and I think it's safe to say that this production crew tried their hardest in most respects. I think they had to fight against some difficulties when they were filming, which we will get into slightly later on. But on the whole, I think you can see that they tried to appeal to that market. They tried to appeal to the fans of Street Fighter. Now, whether or not they achieve that will be for fans of Street Fighter to kind of, decide. I personally was never a massive Street Fighter fan. I've played it with friends, played it with, in arcades, but I've never necessarily been, I've got to go and play the next Street Fighter game. So, perhaps I'm not the best person to talk about whether or not it was successful from a fan point of view. Moving on to the rest of the cast. So in the main role, in the starring role, we have Jean-Claude Van Damme as Colonel Guile. We have, in his last picture, unfortunately, Raul Julia as Bison. We have Ming-Na Wen as Chun-Li. We have Damien Chapa as Ken. We have a very oddly chosen Kylie Minogue as Cammy. We have Simon Callow as an AN official who, unfortunately, never really got a name, so he's just AN official, which again is a bit of a waste of Simon Callow. We have Byron Mann playing Ryu. We have Roshan Seth playing Dalsim. We have Andrew Brunitsky playing Zangief. We have Grandel Bush playing Balrog. We have Robert Mamone playing Carlos Blanca. We have Miguel A. Nunez Jr. playing DJ. We have Greg Rainwater as T-Hawk. We have Kenwa Sawada playing Captain Sawada. We have Jay Tavere playing Vega. We've got Peter Nabi Tusui Sopo playing E Honda. We have Wes Studi playing Victor Sagat. And Jerry Day playing the Lab Guard. So, and that's not an extensive list, but that is pretty much the main characters in that particular film there. And you've got some notable names. Obviously, we've got Jean-Claude Van Damme. We've got Raul Julia. We've got Kylie Minogue for some very strange and odd reason. We've got Simon Callow. So, cast-wise, yes, it's not the greatest cast in the world, but there's some names there that should be pulling in some fans, that should be pulling in some cachet with the audience. Now, unfortunately, they couldn't quite elevate this film to be what we would call critically successful. You know, from an audience point of view, it has an IMDb rating of 4.1 based off 70,000 ratings. We have an 11% Rotten Tomatoes score for the critics, and we have a 20% audience score from about 50,000 ratings. So we can tell pretty much straight away that they were cycling uphill. They would, you know, trying to do what they can to appeal to perhaps too much towards the Street Fighter fans and perhaps not to the average fan. So we probably should really be looking at much better scores based on the fact that they were trying to do too much, I think, in this particular regard. Now, why I think this film doesn't quite work is that, now, I'm all for films not taking themselves too seriously. But I think we never really hear the phrase films taking themselves a bit more seriously, because it does just seem like the script was poking fun at everybody who liked video games. It didn't seem like it was a love letter to people who played games. It didn't seem like they were trying to really trying to make those fans feel like they got their money's worth. It was almost a bit of a, you know, a nudge, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, and, you know, nod to the camera, really. You know, there's some lines in there which you just think, what on earth were they thinking? I mean, it sets it up, you know, on bad footing when in pretty much the opening sequence of the film, you know, you have that live kind of interview between Guile and Bison, and you've got Colonel Guile, who, again, I've never really played Street Fighter for a long period of time, but from what I know of Colonel Guile, he's pretty much a no-nonsense general. Well, colonel, I should say. He's no-nonsense, he gets the job done, and he's, you know, that's kind of my interpretation of him. Now, if he's wrong, I apologise. Street Fighter fans, do not come for me with your pitchforks. But that's kind of my interpretation of him. And straight away, we have this line where I can't remember what Bison says to Guile, but Guile says, well, why don't you take a look at this? And then proceeds to, you know, I never know what you call it, but essentially it's when you, I don't even know what to call it. I'm now doing the action, which is obviously of no use to anybody listening because they can't see what I'm doing. But essentially, it's when you raise your arm in a right angle and then place your other arm on your bicep in a derogatory way. I've never known why that's wrestling fans in a low blow motion. Then you'll know what that means. But I've never really known why that's offensive. But okay, I've seen that done, and okay. But the way that it's done in this film is it's so almost like there's a comic book pal comes after it. It's done in that kind of, you know, tongue-in-cheek way. And I don't think it does that, you know, for comic effect. I think it does that because it doesn't know what it's trying to do. It's not a great line. It's not particularly well written. It just does that, and for me, that kind of set the tone for the rest of the film, because a lot of the jokes fall flat. A lot of the jokes don't quite hit. They never quite know who they're punching towards, who they're aimed at. It's almost like it's, toilet humour. It's not toilet humour, but it's that lowest common denominator type humour where it's almost, it's so unfunny that it's an eye roll moment, that kind of thing. And I think just in general, they seem to, they don't really seem to know what it is they're trying to do. I think that, to have a positive in there, perhaps the most well-known line of this film, where, for you, when the day that bison came to your village, it was the greatest day of your life. But for me, it was Tuesday. I think that's an all right line. Don't get me wrong, it's it's not going to win any Oscars, but I think it tells you what you need to know about the character, that this is just an ordinary day for him, doing what he does, being evil, etc., etc., etc. So I don't think it's too bad in that regard, and I don't think Raoul Julia's delivery of it is bad. I think it's an all right delivery. It achieves the point, but it's almost the way it's shot that then makes that line a little bit too cheesy. It's almost like there's a bit, again, from memory, I watched this the other day, but in my mind there's like this big crescendo of music, and then he says the line and it's like, hey, see what we done there? Whereas if they'd have just let that line sit there and just allow the audience to process it, because essentially what that character's saying is, the day that I ruined your life and killed your family and killed your entire village, that was the worst day of your life. But for me, it was just another day. That's quite an offensive thing to say, but the way they do it is it's just like, oh yeah, that thing that I done, silly me. It's presented in that way, and part of that problem is it ruins the meaning of that line a little bit. Another example of one of the things I think is wrong with this film is that some characters are taken seriously and some characters aren't taken seriously, but it doesn't seem to be in keeping with what the game set out. So, for example, Andrew Bianinski, or however you say his name, I do apologise to anybody if I'm offending anybody with my pronunciation there, but playing Zangief. Again, in my mind, I always played as him because he was the wrestler in Street Fighter, and if you've listened to any of our podcasts, you know that I'm a big wrestling fan. So I always played as him, and again, he was very much no nonsense. He's a big, muscle-bound dude who's massive and strong, and it's very much that he encapsulates all of the fears of the US in the Cold War, that kind of, I don't know if he's Russian, I think he might be, but it's that same kind of sentiment there. But the way that he's treated in this film is he's treated like the butt of all the jokes. The line towards the end of the film where DJ comes up to him and says, come on, Bison's the bad guy, why did you do all of these things? And if he's the bad guy, well, because he paid me a boatload of money. And Zangief goes, you got paid? But again, it's done in that kind of silly Zangief. Isn't he funny because he's so silly? At no point does it really feel like these characters are people. It feels like they're comic devices. It feels like they're there only to serve a function of being a butt of all the jokes, or being this or being that. Never do they think, and I understand that it can be difficult in an hour and 49 minutes or however long the film is to well develop a large amount of characters like you would have in a fighting game. I understand that a fighting game film has to kind of have as many characters in there as much as you can, but that doesn't mean you can't explore those characters and explore those his motivations. Doesn't mean you can't do that. It just means you have to be, a little bit more shrewd about how you go about doing it. But in this context, I do just think that they never quite knew what they were trying to do. I think if we were to make this film now, I think we could learn a lot from what we've seen, and we could do a lot more. Another problem I do have with this film is it centered around Carlos Blanca. Now, anybody who knows the film, knows the game, knows that Blanca is, I don't really know what he is, but in this context, I don't know if it's taken from the games, but in this context, he's one of the allies of Colonel Guile for the AN, the not so subtle metaphor for the UN, the Allied Nations, but he's one of the hostages, and he gets experimented on by Bison and by Dalsim, but Dalsim is the one is trying to keep him human, because he's only doing this because of Bison forcing him to do it, etc, etc, etc. And so again, that should be quite again, we don't need to go rated R with this. We don't need to go, certificate 18 with this. But we can be a little bit dark in these elements, and we can actually explore the fact that we've got a human being here being experimented on and being turned into something more than human or not human. We can do that. But and yes, okay, how do you do that with a character who has green skin and, frizzy ginger hair? How do you do that? But one way is to not make the hair frizzier than it needs to be, like it does in this film. At one point, it seemingly does seem to be that the humidity is making his hair more bushy than it needs to be. There's ways in which you can do it, and there's ways in which you can make it look a little bit more scary and frightening than it is in this film. I think they went the Incredible Hulk route from the 70s, the Lou Ferrigno Incredible Hulk look, which was okay in the 70s and the 80s. And okay, this isn't, modern day, but it's 94. So in film, we're looking at stuff and we're going, well, there were things that were being done that we could have looked at, that we could have, had it a bit more, a bit more realistic and a bit more, frightening, and a bit more, well, what is Blanca? What is he being turned into? But unfortunately, it's again treated. It's one of the only things in the film that is treated seriously. But because the rest of the film is treating everything like a bit of a joke, it feels very out of place. And also it jars with what we actually see. It's like, oh no, we're making him less than human. And it's like, yeah, but you're making him into an idiot at the same time. It doesn't really work. He's supposed to be a savage in that regard, and he isn't really that. He's more, a bit of a joke. Again, a bit of a joke. And, in my mind, Zangief and Blanca are the two characters, one, along with Bison now, two of the characters in Street Fighter that should be a little bit kind of, intimidating and frightening. And I think it's just, then again, I understand, because they've got so many characters in here that you can't spend, a long amount of time focusing on each character for long periods of time. I get that. But it doesn't mean we should completely forget and completely ignore backstory and character motivation and what's driving these characters in most part. I think that, to be honest, the only people that I think do a good job with their characters, I think, is Raul Julia. And I think there may be a little bit of kind of sentiment there, because obviously this was his last film, but he's the only one who kind of delicately has that. He does the maniacal kind of, trying to take over the world look. He does that when he needs to do that, but for the most part, it works. I think, part of the problem is he's opposite Jean-Claude Van Damme, who we know is never really going to be considered a fantastic actor. He's there because of his martial arts skills, which is understandable, totally understandable. However, this film was, I think it's about an hour and 49 minutes. So quite a long film for what it is. Usually you're looking at an hour and 30, hour and 20, hour and 30 for video game type films. So I understand that. But an hour and 49 is quite a lot of time. And so it's surprising when we don't get that character development in most part. There's not a single character here that is developed. It's like as soon as you get to something that may be a little bit interesting in developing a character, it's like, oh no, we're gonna go to somebody else now. We're gonna go over here, we're gonna go over here, we're gonna go over there. It never really makes sense. The one thing you bring to a Jean-Claude Van Damme film, as I said earlier, is his martial arts skills. And for the most part, he doesn't use them in this film. And it's not like they're trying to subvert the genre. They're trying to subvert what we expect from Jean-Claude Van Damme. Because he's playing Colonel Guile in the lead role in a video game adaptation film that was based on a fighting game. And yet we don't really see him up until the end fight scene with Bison. We don't really see him do much martial arts. If it's like in bits and bobs, but it's never really, it's never really ever, like the whole point of having Jean-Claude Van Damme is so that you can do great fight scenes, and he's never really used in a fight scene. So what's the bloody point in having him? That's what I can't get past, and admittedly, there may be some good reason as to why he never really got to that point. If we start looking at some of the, some of the stories behind the way this film was made, it makes a bit more sense. So, for those who don't know, apparently Jean-Claude Van Damme revealed that during filming he did have a drug problem. Apparently he was doing around about $10,000 worth of cocaine a week. So let's just say he wasn't completely focused. Let's be generous there. And apparently he had an affair with Kylie Minogue. Whether that's true, I don't know. I don't know if Jean-Claude Van Damme should be completely believed there or not. I don't know. I'm not saying he did. I'm not saying he didn't. But I think it's fair to say that he wasn't completely focused on making the best film he could make. And apparently that got in the way of, Stephen E. D'Souza's, ability to direct. And so because of that, it caused disruptions during filming, which when you have disruptions in filming, it's going to create that atmosphere and that frustration, particularly with the rest of the cast. If they're doing everything that they can, they're being on time, they're not causing reshoots and delays and etc. It's going to create a little bit of a fragmented set. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes that can come across on screen, which I think it 100% does in this instance. If you're calling in sick, leaving the set, showing up late, or not showing up at all, forcing the director to film other scenes when it's not on the call sheet for that day or it's not in the schedule, it's never going to be working to optimum performance levels, is it? It's going to be, I think anybody who works in any kind of environment knows that if it's disruption to your work, or there's things preventing you from doing work, or things preventing you from doing your best work, it's always going to be very, very difficult to be in a position where you're going, well, yeah, that is a really good piece of work because, of those factors involved. So again, a little bit of understanding there, a little bit of backstory as to why this potentially didn't necessarily work and didn't have the level of critical a claim that perhaps it could have done. I'm not going to say should have done, but it could have done. It could have been good, but unfortunately, it just didn't. And case in point, in 2010, in Empire's 50 worst movies ever, this ranks number 27. So not the worst film ever, but certainly in the top 50, according to Empire. Tells you everything you kind of need to know, really. And I think part of the problem, as I've alluded to, is it never quite knew who to be targeting. In some cases, they were targeting the fans too much. Case in point, the final scene, they all do, or the very, very final shot, they all do a pose. For fans, they will know that that's their win animation from the game, or as close to as it can be in live action. But for anybody else, they'd be like, well, that's a bit corny. I don't get that. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that's part of the problem, I think, sometimes when you do video game films. And, just on the subject of Jean-Claude Van Damme, he turned down the role of Johnny Cage in the Mortal Kombat film that came out in 95. So he could have gone on to do, or could have been in another video game film in the Mortal Kombat films. But he turned down that role in order to do this. So, and I mentioned earlier that Kylie Minogue was a bit of an odd choice. I don't really understand why she's in this, really, because it's not like she's adding anything. I think you could take her character out and it doesn't really make a difference to the movie. I understand it was at a time where Kylie Minogue acting was more acceptable because she was in Neighbours and things like that, and she wasn't quite yet, the big musical star that we know her to be now. But at the same time, it's still a bit odd. It's still a bit weird. But Stephen E. D'Souza apparently wanted her after seeing the Australian Actors Guild and wanted to cast an Australian actor. So he decides to cast the person he saw on the Australia's People magazine on a plane to Bangkok. That's what he saw, and he went, I'm going to cast her. So that's why he kind of done that. And in his direction, one thing which I think he should be commended for, that probably a lot of directors, wouldn't necessarily do, but he deferred all of his salary to pay the cast. So he's not making any money here himself personally. He's not making money. He's saying, well, no, I'm going to pay the cast with my fee. So, commendable. I would have preferred it if he'd have taken a salary and made a better film, but that's just me. But, to be commended nonetheless. But I think part of the reason maybe why this film wasn't quite what it could have been and wasn't quite, the critical success that it could have been, is because naturally when you have video game films that are based on a pre-existing property, you have, like you do with movies anyway, you have studio interference. In video games, it's the same thing. And apparently that the first cut of the film was rated R, and Capcom basically said, no, this should be PG-13. So, and I can understand that because they want to appeal to the biggest market. They want to make the most money. Rated R films at that time weren't known for making big money. So I can understand that. So naturally, if you've got a rated R film and you've now got to make it PG-13, you've got to do some work in the cutting room floor. You've got to do some work in editing, and Stephen E. D'Souza called that the kiss of death because no teenager wants to see a G-rated film, so they bumped up to PG-13. So it's very, very difficult. I think G rating for English fans, I think is the equivalent of a PG over here. PG-13 is like a 12. So you can understand where some of the difficulties may have lied in this particular movie. And, I may be being a bit harsh on it, but that's only because I want video game movies to be good. I don't want it to be the run to the litter. I don't want it to be frowned upon and go, well, it's a video game movie, so don't expect too much. I want it to be good. And that studio interference can really sometimes be, as D'Souza said, a kiss of death. They held, Capcom held the rights to the game naturally and was a major contributor to the budget. So naturally they're gonna go, well, we're paying for this film, so you've got to do what we want you to do. And as a result, apparently Stephen E. D'Souza needed approval on pretty much everything. So he didn't have autonomy and didn't have that ability to go, this is what I want to do, this is what I'm going to create. And that's the vision we have. He's going, well, I want to create this, but I'm being told I've got to do this. And what that does mean in a lot of situations is that the director goes, well, I want to do this, they want me to do that, so let's meet in the middle. And you're constantly being, your creative mind is constantly being stifled. And we mentioned earlier the amount of characters in there. Apparently that was a Capcom decision. They wanted to get as many characters in there for the fans of the game, which I think was to its detriment, because as I said, there wasn't really any time for any character development, because as soon as you get to a piece of interesting storyline or interesting kind of topics, you're then moving on to a completely different character, and it's very, very difficult to attach yourself to that character, particularly if you've not played the games. So again, it's very, very difficult in that situation. But having said that, Stephen E. D'Souza did try to incite some of his influences on the film. So apparently, James Bond spy films were some of the influences, and perhaps you can kind of see that particularly with the stealth boat idea. That feels a little bit James Bond. I mean, in that scene, how it's a stealth boat when it decides to go and blow up all the radar dishes anyway. So how is it stealth? You cannot see it, but if someone's blowing something up, you're going to notice that there's something there or something's not going right. And again, some Star Wars influences on the film, which again probably kind of fits in a little bit with the that kind of feeling of having one particular megalomaniac, wanting to take over the world, elements of Star Wars in there, so you can kind of see that. But I think on the whole, to sum up Street Fighter, it's very, very difficult, isn't it, to get on board with this film when it never really takes itself seriously enough. It's constantly joking. You've got too many characters in there, so you can't attach yourself to any of the characters and feel like you know the character, which is only exasperated if you've not seen or played the games. But even if you have played the games, I never felt particularly, connected to any of the characters there. Perhaps my favourite character from Street Fighter was always Honda. I don't know why, I just like that character, and I didn't mind, his character, the character in this, but I was never really attached. Never, so when he's being tortured, I didn't really care. Unfortunately, it never felt as though he was in peril. Never felt as though any of the, it just felt boring. And in an hour and 49 minutes, which isn't a long film. Okay, it may be long for traditional video game movies, but it's not a particularly long film. But it felt, every minute of those hour and 49 minutes, it felt so long for the runtime it was. And I think when you're finding a film particularly long, you're not naturally going to enjoy it. And I think that's the most damning criticism that you can give to the Street Fighter film.
VHS is yesterday's news. Out with the old and in with the new. You heard it here first. Betamax is where it is happening. And the only place to start your collection is the Willie Parks Betamax Parlor. We have all the greats and the hidden gems you've never heard of. Like the Crocodile Killer, Which Way is West and How Do I Get There? And of course, the classic, And Maggots Ate My Homework. That's just the tip of the iceberg. All you need is a thirst for the silver screen and a compatible Betamax player to enjoy everything we have to offer at Willie Parks' Betamax Parlor. You don't even need a membership, just imagination. Located opposite the Little Chef on the Walworth Road, ask for Willie and you could be one step closer to Betamax satisfaction.
Good evening and welcome to Inside the Actor's Mind, the show that delves deep into the psyche to find out what makes a great character, a great performance, and what makes a great actor. I am Julius Oxbridge Teeth III. Join me as we go deep into the actor's mind. I'm Julius Oxbridge Teeth III. Won't you join me next week as we go deep into the actor's mind?
So moving on quickly to my second pick for video games that got it wrong, I'm going to choose Assassin's Creed. Now, it's strange that I didn't actually go and see this film when it first came out because I really liked the first game and I didn't play the second, didn't play the third for some strange reason because I liked the first one, and I really liked Origins as well, the one that was set in Egypt. So it seems like a film that I'd actually want to go and see. But for some reason, I never got around to it. And over time since it came out, the more and more that I'd seen about it, the less I wanted to go and see it. I'd heard some not great things about it from people who'd been to see it. And so it never really got to a point where I was like, I need to go and see that film. And actually, I only really watched it because it fit in with the subject of this particular episode. So let's get back to the plot. So, through a revolutionary technology that unlocks his genetic memories, Callum Lynch, Michael Fassbender, experiences the adventures of his ancestor Anguilla de Nerja in 15th century Spain. Callum discovers he is descended from a mysterious secret society, the Assassins, and amasses incredible knowledge and skills to take on the oppressive and powerful Templar organisation in present day. So, in that respect, very, very similar to the first game, although it doesn't focus on the same named characters, but essentially very, very similar setup as the first game. But unfortunately, that's kind of where the similarities kind of end, really. It's an hour and 55 minutes, this film, so it's not a massively long film, but it was boring. It's just so boring. I really sat down and really tried to get on board with this film. Tried to give it an open mind. Okay, yes, I'd chosen this specifically because I knew it was critically it was a bad film. But that doesn't mean I wanted it to be bad. It doesn't mean that I wanted to not like it. I don't think I ever go into that. Go into the movie theatre or when I sit down and watch a movie, I never want something to be bad. But unfortunately, with this, it was just so incredibly boring. I was just sitting there going, why do I care? Why do I care about any of the things that I'm seeing on the screen right now, or listening to any of the dialogue that's happening? Why do I care? And I never got an answer, unfortunately. There wasn't, at least with Street Fighter previously. Yes, it's probably one of the worst films ever made, but there are elements where you go, oh, nice little nod there, nice little thing there. And whilst there probably are things for people who are massive, massive fans of Assassin's Creed, there wasn't anything that stuck out to me that made me go, oh, that's a nice little nod. Oh, I see what they've done there. Or, oh, that's a commendable thing to do. That was good. There was nothing like that, unfortunately. Almost all of this was very much me going, here we go again. It wasn't, I just found it very, very difficult to get any redeeming features out of it. Now, I'm going to try not to stay this, too negatively. Ironically, I started off the episode by saying didn't want to pick a U-bowl film because I didn't want it to be too negative. So I'm going to try not to be. I'm going to tell you why I think it didn't work, but I'm not going to, try not to be too negative in that respect. But if we look at the box office figures, so obviously this came out on December 21st, 2016, so a running theme of December releases for video game movies, or at least in respect of the last two. Odd coincidence. So this had a budget of $125 million, which is they put some big bucks into this. So that they had to do a lot to get their money back on this one. And again, much like Street Fighter, in its opening weekend, it was a bit of squeaky bum time again. 10 million or 10.2 million made on its opening weekend, which, when you've got a $125 million budget and you've not even made 10% back in your opening weekend, that's when you go, right, okay, then we may not be making money here. And a similar story again in terms of the figures. In terms of the US and Canada, it didn't make any money. It only made $54 million. So, and that's not even half of its budget. That's when you're starting to really go, okay, we need, not quite a miracle, but we're hoping for something like that anyway. And luckily they got it, because it made $240 million across the world. So it did make back its budget and almost doubled it, but for what looked like a while, it didn't seem like it was going to make too much money back. Now, again, I think the vast majority of that budget, like Street Fighter, isn't because of people hearing good things about it. I think it's because people hear Assassin's Creed, they associate it with the game naturally, and they go, oh, that might be interesting. I like the game. Let's go and watch that. It's a cool name for a film anyway. So perhaps people who didn't know the game, didn't know anything about, the release on consoles, and going, what's that about? Oh, that sounds quite interesting. May have given it a go. And perhaps those people like it who don't know anything about the game. I'm not sure, but generally speaking, it doesn't appear that way. So the crew who made this film, so it was directed by Justin Kurzel. It was written by Michael Leslie, Adam Cooper, and Bill Collage. Produced by Jean-Julien Baronet, Patrick Crowley, and Michael Fassbender, who also starred in the film, and Gerard Goulemont. It was composed by Jed Kurtzel, so I'm guessing there may be some familial connection there, because it's a very strange, or not strange, but a very unusual name. So should have researched that before filming the episode, but we like to keep things loose with Bury Our Bones with Cinema here. But the cinematographer was Adam Arcapar. It was edited by Christopher Tellisfon, casting director was Gina J, and the production designer was Andy Nicholson. So, the fact that Michael Fassbender produced this movie shows that he was on board with trying to make this film. in the sense of he's not just picking up a paycheck and going, right, what do you need me to do? Okay, I'll do this, I'll do that. He's gone a bit more than that, which again is something to be commended, is something to be, it's always good when you have actors who are invested in a project rather than people who are just picking up a paycheck and are just doing things by their numbers. So it's a good thing there. Whether or not that's translated, I don't think so personally, but that's not to say that he didn't work hard and that the crew didn't work hard. Again, probably much like Street Fighter, I don't think anybody goes out and intentionally makes a bad film. People do work hard on these things. It's just sometimes their ability is sometimes not what it needs to be for the film. Sometimes it's being misguided, and sometimes it's because of handcuffs. And we're going to perhaps why Assassin's Creed for me didn't quite work and got it wrong when it comes to adapting from video games. And if we look at the ratings, I think, again, people kind of tend to agree with me. So, not that, again, we only like to, include these ratings, not necessarily because it tells you the film's rubbish or tells you the film's good, but it just gives you a little bit of context as to, the audience perception and the critical reception of these films. So, 5.6 out of 10 from a 209,000 user ratings on IMDb, a critical rating of 18% on Rotten Tomatoes, and an audience score of 42% on Rotten Tomatoes from about 50,000+ ratings. So it tells you that, generally speaking, people weren't happy with this film. And I've got my reasons for why I think this film didn't work, and whether or not those are the same reasons. Maybe some of them are, but generally speaking, people weren't that impressed with this film. And to be totally honest with you, when you look at the budget, when you look at the names who are in this film, it should be working, or there should be a lot to work with here. As we mentioned earlier, we've got Michael Fassbender playing Callum Lynch and Aguilia. Michael Fassbender is a fantastic actor. He can hold his own. So, strange that it didn't quite work here. We've got Marion Cotillard, again, a fantastic actress. Oscar-worthy performer. I believe she won the Best Actress for La Vie en Rose, playing Edith Piaf. Sorry. We've got Scar himself, Jeremy Irons. Again, another fantastic actor. Moving on, we have Brendan Gleeson, another fantastic actor. We've got Charlotte Rampling, another fantastic actress. We've got Michael Kenneth Williams, a good actor. So this film has some of the components to be, at least from a performance aspects, very, very good. And I don't think, to be fair, any of the acting performances in this are bad. Don't think that's the case here. I don't think they're noteworthy. I think they're a little bit by the numbers, but luckily, because of the people we have in the film, they can get away with it. But as I say, not bad performances by any stretch of the imagination when it comes to this film. I think part of the problem that I had with this is, first of all, I think, and again, this perhaps goes a little bit too much into video games. So anybody who hasn't played video games or hasn't played the game may not have this same thought. But one of the problems I think they had with this is that the worst thing about the Assassin's Creed games are the elements that are set in present day. Those are always the things that, particularly as games have gone on and new iterations have happened, people have liked less and less. And if anything, they're the bits that people want to get rid of from Assassin's Creed, which is a perfectly legitimate argument. The problem here is that I would say, rather than it being like most Assassin's Creed games where it's about 10% present day or the present day of the world, and 90% in, whatever particular setting it is, in this case, 15th century Spain. That works, because if you don't like that modern element. It's not there too much for you to go, oh God, I just want to get through this bit and get back to that. You do have that a little bit, but it's not to a point where it's at a massive detriment of the game. The problem here is that the balance is, I would say, probably more 70-30 in present day, maybe 60-40, but certainly a sizable chunk is spent in present day here, which is, if it didn't have the word Assassin's Creed attached to it, it may have worked and may have been fine, but it very much isn't what Assassin's Creed is. It's not necessarily about the character in modern day. I know that Desmond from the original game, and I believe 2 and 3, was a well-liked character. But in all honesty, people play those games to be playing in 15th century Spain or in ancient Egypt or in ancient Greece or wherever these games are set. That's what they're playing as. They're not playing to be, some essentially nobody who happens to have a very important ancestor in this particular conspiracy, in this particular world of Templars and Assassin's Creed. That's not why people play the games. And similarly, this isn't why people want to go and watch the film. There's a reason why things like Lord of the Rings, for the most part, are successful. It's not just because of good writing. It's also because it shows you this world that people can lose themselves in. Part of the problem with the Assassin's Creed film is that the present day world is very bland, isn't particularly exciting and very interesting, and we don't get to see enough of the old, the 15th century Spain to really connect with. I think that's probably the biggest problem, really. And I think following on from that, one of the issues that I kind of had, which for a Western audience or an English-speaking audience, it becomes a little bit more difficult to connect with characters when all of the dialogue is in that particular language of where it's set. That's not always the case, as you can see from our episode on Ring. Sometimes that can add to a film, sometimes it can detract. I think in this instance, where it is mainly for a Western audience, we do have that Western sensibilities in the present day, so it doesn't quite work when we don't have that same ability to connect in 15th century Spain. Now, yes, if we're being totally accurate, they wouldn't be speaking English, they would be speaking Spanish. That makes sense. But sometimes making sense doesn't always mean it's going to be a good film. It doesn't always mean it's going to tell a good story and people are going to connect with it. So I think that's part of the difficulty I had in terms of trying to actually get on board with this particular narrative that it was telling. Where it really starts to kind of starts to get difficult to engage with this particular film is when it starts changing things from the game and to its detriment. I think that's where people start to really kind of get a little bit frustrated with. So one of the things, and I apologise because I haven't played Assassin's Creed the original in quite some time. So if I'm wrong about this, then by all means call me up on it, and comment on our socials and say, Ryan, you got that one wrong there. That is in the original, but from memory, I don't ever remember Desmond being a prisoner, in the sense of he's gone to prison and he's a bad dude by all means. He's a murderer like Callum is in this iteration. I don't remember that, and I'm pretty sure that's not the case, but if I'm wrong, I apologise. But that was one thing that I really kind of found difficult to get past, because I'm going, okay, well, they've made that decision and to divert and to create that character. I can understand wanting to not focus on the character of Desmond, because for the most part, he's not the character that people are interested in. So I kind of get that. But to make this character be on death row, be sentenced to death, and then be brought back to life in some way for this particular purpose, because again, that's kind of glossed over. Has he been brought back to life? Has he actually been killed? Did they fake his death? It wasn't really explained. It kind of glosses over it and goes, you don't need to really pay attention to it. But making him that element of character by having those, that criminal history and that element, I'm going, well, why is that? Because all that makes me do is not connect with that character, because I can't identify with a killer who's been killed on death row. I can't identify with that. He doesn't seem to want to redeem himself. They never really tell you who he killed. They kind of allude to the fact that he saw his mum get killed by his father as the reason for it, but that seems very much like a bit of an excuse. So it's all K's like that, because it doesn't really, it just doesn't really add anything to the character. All it does is mean that it's more difficult to be on board with. Okay, why do we now think he's playing the good? Why is he playing the good guy now? Why is that? Okay, what's his change of heart? It doesn't really make any logical sense in my mind. It's very difficult to get on board with and very difficult to connect with the character. Which when you're the lead character in a film, you kind of expect the audience are going to have to connect with them. If they don't, it's going to be very, very hard to enjoy the movie. So that one kind of, deviation from the source material is where I have a bit of problem. The next one, it may be fairly innocuous to some people, but for me really detracted again, and it's the actual use of the animus system. Now in the game, again from memory, I haven't played it in a long time, so I apologise, but from memory it was more of like a sleep pod, or a sleeping kind of thing that sent you to sleep. And almost in a dreamlike sequence, you then lived out, the memories of your ancestors, and I think that's pretty much the same kind of element all throughout the series. And that works, because again, it's not putting too much emphasis on how this works or how this does this, or doesn't really ask. It leaves enough to the imagination for you to create your own answers without giving you too much to go, well, this is how it works and this is this is this, So I kind of get that. Get on board with that. But in the film, they've made it more of some kind of like virtual reality type thing where you're attached to what looks like a massive arm, mechanical arm, and you physically act out these things as if they're happening in front of you, which again takes you in a different direction and means that you're no longer living the memories you're now reenacting the memories, which is a bit weird and a bit different, and actually doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like there's one particular scene where, and the way it works is that, it's this big mechanical arm and it's almost worn around your waist from behind like a belt in some ways. So, and then there's an element where he's acting out this memory and he does a forward roll, but it conveniently switches from present day to then going into 15th century Spain as he does it, because then you can't see how he does a forward roll in present day, because if from what you've seen it doesn't make sense, because he wouldn't be able to do a forward roll. So it just doesn't make any sense, and I'm sitting there going, well, hang on a minute, I'm now taken out of the film because that very small thing that they've changed has now created a problem that didn't need to be there, didn't need to create. And in those action sequences, which for the most part, when we see it in 15th century Spain, are very well shot, very well done. it constantly takes you back out of it, because then it switches from showing it in present day in this big room, like, animus area, to 15th century Spain. So you're constantly going, I'm getting on board with this historical setting and what it looks like, and bang, I'm back to present day. Now I'm going to go back to 15th century Spain, start getting on board, and then the same happens again. So you never have time to really kind of engage with that setting. It spends far too much time flitting backwards and forwards, constantly reminding you that you're actually in present day, which is one of the beauties I found with the game in that balance, was that you would go long chunks of time of playing the game and you'd forget that you're actually somebody in present day experiencing this through the animus. That's part of the beauty there. And I think they could have done that here. They could have spent the vast majority of time in 15th century Spain. I understand they need to set things up. I understand they need to create, that viewpoint and that world, but I feel like they, in keeping with the title of the episode, they just got it wrong. I think they have somebody like Brendan Gleeson, who they kind of waste. He's only really in it for a scene or two. It's a bit wasteful. Whilst he's not bad in it, if you've got Brendan Gleeson, bloody well use him. He's great. Why are you not using him more? So that kind of detracted again for me. And I think the one last thing I will say on why I don't think it works is because there was just a few kind of plot holes where they're searching for this item called the Apple of Eden, which they explain to Michael Fassbender's character will find the solution to all of world violence, which, I mean, you very quickly can twig that there's something he doesn't know that they're not telling him, so that makes sense. And actually it then poses the question towards the end of the film that actually what they're trying to find is this item that can, I think, again, just not very well explained, but it's something to do with taking people's free will away, so their ability to choose what they want to do, and etc., etc. So I can get on board with that. That doesn't really bother me. But where I do have the problem is that they specifically target Michael Fassbender's character because he has the correct bloodline. The last known person to know where this Apple of Eden item is in Michael Fassbender's bloodline. That makes sense. What doesn't make sense is in this present day setting, it's a prison type environment where there's loads and loads of different assassins. To which I'm asking, well, if they're only searching for the Apple of Eden, which is what they seem to only be searching for, who are the rest of them and why they're there? Because they're clearly not the right bloodline. Because as they've explained in the film, once they're done with you, they get rid of you. Okay, you could argue, how are they going to get rid of you? Are you going to let me go and let me live my life, or are you going to kill me? Interpret that any which way you want. But that's what they've said will happen. Why are they still there? Doesn't make any sense. So it's just another plot hole that's been made because of the way in which you've decided to tell that story. Why deviate from the game where there's one particular person, there's a small group of people who work with you in the animus. Okay, yes, there's this not seen, not heard, company who are funding this. That's fine. That's where you can explore it in later iterations, etc., etc. Because let's face it, this film was always going to be the first of a franchise if it worked well, as was the games, But by doing that, all it means is that now we're going, well, we've seen virtually, the extent of this, so anything else we see isn't that shocking. However, if we'd have only seen the one character and then we're towards the end of the film, it's not just you, and it's not just the thing we're looking for. We're looking for anything that can help with our cause, and we've got hundreds and hundreds of people. But we don't really care now because we already knew from the start. But it doesn't really make sense because they're not. It never really goes down that. So again, something very, very difficult for me to get on board with. So I'm going to move on to some, facts about how the film was made, and maybe that will allude to why this perhaps didn't work. And I think the most telling thing here, obviously, as I mentioned earlier, Michael Fassbender was actively participating, in the film's post-production, and it's, in producing the film. So apparently he helped with editing and things like that. But originally the film was going to be around 2 hours and 20 minutes, which I think probably would have benefited, the film a little bit, because it would have had more time to explain some of these character choices and explain some of these, if not being funny, if you're going to try and explain how the animus works, you need time to explain it, because otherwise it's just going to feel very flippant and, okay. If you're going to keep it shrouded in how does this work, you don't need to know that type of thing. Then okay, it does work with glossing over it. But if you're going to make out like you're going to tell the audience how it works, you do need a bit more time on there. So I kind of get, when it was shortened down to 1 hour and 48, that's half an hour's worth of content that is now missing from the film. So I kind of get, perhaps that's why it felt in some places like, plot lines weren't totally connected and, things weren't entirely thought out, because perhaps they were, they were in the scripts and they just got cut from the script, and actually the film script apparently was, constantly being revised in production, so a lot of deleted scenes apparently, and again, that's always a difficult thing to get on board with, because then performances can sometimes suffer, because you're going, okay, well, why am I doing this? Well, we don't know that yet. We haven't got to that stage yet. Or you go, oh, okay, well, I know why my character does this, because he then does this later on in the film, or he does that, or they do this, or whatever it may be. But then that gets rewritten. So now that doesn't make sense at all. That kind of makes sense. I can understand that when it comes to some performances and why things feel a little bit, a little bit flippant in places. But I mean, in terms of direction, it's difficult because it feels like a very directorless film, in the sense of it doesn't try to, although I've said it deviates from the game, which it does, it doesn't deviate so much for you to go, well, this is a completely different vision for this film. So it's now actually not Assassin's Creed as you know it. It doesn't do that, so it makes you really connect with something else, because it's clearly something else. It kind of sits in the middle, where it's not the game that you actually played in movie form, but it's also not a completely different thing altogether. So it's kind of neither here nor there. But apparently Michael Fassbender lobbied to have Justin Kurzel as the director, because they had worked together previously on Macbeth, which, if you've got a director that you like working with, again, Macbeth had that historical setting, so it kind of works. And again, Michael Fassbender asked Marion Cotillard to be his co-star again. So again, you've got a little three-piece of performers there and director who have worked together, so they know what other people's kind of, how they like to work and what they do. Unfortunately, I just feel like, there wasn't enough of a love for the game, in this particular movie. Otherwise, I think it could have been a good film, and I don't think it was, But Fassbender was attached to it from quite an early stage, and he was attracted to the project because he wanted to do a fantasy film that was rooted in science. Well, this is the perfect kind of thing then, isn't it? Because it does have that, that idea of Templars versus Assassins was that kind of fantasy element, but then it does have that scientific edge to it where you go, okay, that makes sense. And perhaps that's why they explored that science element a little bit more, because Fassbender was intrigued by that. I mean, one thing that, again, we always go back to distributors and studios and having an input. So Ubisoft, who made the game, they apparently changed the distributor from Sony to 20th Century Fox though the reason has not been made known, although it could, in my eyes, it could be possibly related to the Sony Pictures leak in 2014. So, it's 2 years after that. So, when they were filming this, could have been, So again, that could be a reason there. And again, when you change distributors, sometimes that can change the marketing. That can mean that, this particular film looks like a certain thing in this trailer, but then actually turns out to be a totally different film. I'm not saying that was the case here. It kind of always looked like what it was meant to be, but it creates issues that otherwise wouldn't arise if you just had the same distributor the whole way through the project. So that kind of makes sense. And as I alluded to earlier, a sequel was planned, and it's quite clear at the end of the film that they are kind of nodding towards there being a sequel, and the assassins coming together to kind of explore that story between the Templars and the assassins. It makes sense, but unfortunately, with the purchase of 20th Century Fox by Disney, meant they cancelled it, and I think it's a shame because sometimes a sequel, when the first iteration isn't particularly very good, a sequel can make amends. So we perhaps won't see that. Unfortunately, what it probably does mean is in about 10 years' time we'll probably get a reboot. If 10 years, it may even be sooner than that. We know what Hollywood like to do. They like to erase history and say, well, no, this is actually the film that we wanted to make back then. So it's always difficult to kind of really look at things and go, yeah, we don't need another Assassin's Creed film. I think the one thing that perhaps does work in its favour with Assassin's Creed is that obviously each game has a completely different, a large number of games has a completely different setting, so it can easily do that sequel thing and go, well, whilst it's the same world, it's not exactly directly leading on from that. They can pick a new setting, they could potentially pick a new lead, they can do all the things that they want to do. It's very much an anthology type narrative, a bit like, American Horror Story. Each season's a different story, that kind of thing. It works, and it can work in that particular setting. But I think in closing, we've spoken about video game adaptations, and we've spoken about two ones that got it wrong. And I think as I alluded to at the start, it's going to be difficult to translate the feel of a game it's going to be difficult to translate the feel of a game when you put it into a different medium. For the most part, we're playing as characters in games. We are the characters, or we are interacting specifically with a character. Whereas in a movie, it's a very passive medium where we're taking it on and we're processing it rather than going, okay, I'm doing this as the character. So it's just a different way of telling a story, and sometimes that can be a very difficult thing to get across in a movie when the vast majority of a game you're doing something that the movie is never going to show you, i.e., let's say Tomb Raider as an example. The vast majority of that game, a bit like Uncharted, the vast majority of that game you're going to be climbing on stuff and platforming. You're not going to watch an hour and a half of somebody doing that. It's just a little bit of shooting here and there, a little bit of a boss battle, and then we're going to have Lara Croft, or we're going to have Nathan Drake, or even Assassin's Creed. We're going to have them climbing on stuff, for the rest of the film. It's never really going to work in that regard. I think also another reason as well is we think of games, okay, in the modern world, games are are considerably shorter than what they were, but compared to films, they have a longer time to tell their story. So we play games sometimes, depending on what type of game it is, anywhere from 4 hours all the way up to 40 hours and then some, So we're spending a lot more time in the world. And sometimes that's going to be difficult to translate that to movies, because generally speaking, you're probably going to have between an hour and a half and 2.5 hours, 3 hours, which if it's 3 hours, then people are going to switch off anyway, because 3 hours is a long time. You have to really be good at what you do to get people engaged for 3 hours. But generally speaking, you've got a lot less time to tell that story in a movie. And I think that can be very, very difficult sometimes, because a lot of the quirks of the character are played come across in those elements where it's not a cutscene. It comes across in, I've just done this particular action and that's how this person's reacted. It's a very different way of telling that story, and it's a very different amount of time to tell the story. And I think my last point on why these films perhaps haven't worked, and it kind of goes back to that Star Wars issue. Star Wars fans have always been very, very particular in what they want, very, very divisive, and very, very, passionate when they don't get what they want or when they dislike something. And I think maybe not to the same extent, but certainly video game fans, when it comes to video games, are very much like that. But when it comes to movies, that can sometimes carry across. So I think sometimes our expectations of what a movie should be can sometimes hinder it. For example, I've gone into Street Fighter and I've gone into Assassin's Creed wanting a particular thing, which we all do when we watch movies anyway. But because I have a very particular set of skills, that's a very bad Liam Neeson impression there. But I have a very particular idea of what I want from a game, from a movie based on a game. Immediately it's going to cloud my judgment when I watch something. And I think sometimes that can be a little bit of the problem. And I think as audience members who play games, when we see a game that's being made into a movie, perhaps we just need to give it a little bit more time of day, and we just need to be a little less angry when we don't get what we want.
Visit the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium for all your citrus fruit needs. Visit us in-store to peruse our limitless supply of Burmese citrus fruits, plus browse our selection of Lunchables. Or shop online using discount code I Bloody Told You to receive a 10% discount on our lean, mean tangerine machine for all your juicing needs. That's the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium, Bond Street, London, England. We have tangerines the size of rubies.
Unfortunately, that brings us on to the end of the episode. We hope you've enjoyed listening. Don't forget to follow us from wherever you get your podcasts from, and also head over to our social media platforms in order to stay up to date. So until next time, he's been Jimmy Murphy, I've been Ryan Etherington, and we have been Bury Our Bones with Cinema. And it will be a one-button job. Boom, 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 toom, toom, toom.
I have a terrible tendency to just swear without but you're talking when we're doing it. I still find it slightly distracting.
It's a bit weird, but I think it's a bit weird. But I suppose
maybe if you listen to this back, see if it sounds. I was like, I'm gonna have to stop it.